War crimes whistleblower trial date set. Ex-military lawyer David McBride detailed allegations of possible unlawful killings by Australian forces in Afghanistan. A trial date has been set in the case of the former Australian military lawyer, David McBride, who is accused of leaking allegations of misconduct, including unlawful killings of civilians, by members of the country's special forces in Afghanistan. Chief Justice Lucy McCallum, in a Thursday hearing at the Australian Capital Territory Act, Supreme Court ordered that McBride must stand trial this year, with a court date set for November 6. This means some 4 years and 8 months will have passed since McBride was first formally charged. The 60-year-old is accused of leaking classified military intelligence to 3 journalists at the Australian broadcaster ABC. The information revealed potential gross misconduct by members of the country's special forces serving in Afghanistan, including the possible unlawful killings of at least 39 prisoners and civilians. He has pleaded not guilty to 5 charges related to unauthorized disclosure of information and violations of the country's Defence Act. The prosecutorial pursuit has led to claims that McBride is being unfairly treated by Australian authorities. Rather than prosecuting whistleblowers, the Australian government should get on with fixing whistleblowing law and ensuring accountability for Australia's wrongdoing in Afghanistan, said human rights lawyer Kieran Pender via the Canberra Times on Thursday. He added that Attorney General Mark Dreyfus should dismiss the charges. The sensitive military information allegedly distributed by McBride was used by ABC in the 2017 television documentary The Afghan Files. ABC's offices in Sydney were subsequently raided by Australia's federal police in 2019. The military leaks also formed the basis of the Brereton Report, which delivered its findings in 2020, with a redacted version released to the public almost 2 weeks later. It detailed a variety of misconduct within the ranks of Australian military services in Afghanistan between 2005 and 2016. Including placing evidence of weapon use on civilians killed in combat. The inquiry also found that junior soldiers were encouraged to murder prisoners in order to get their first kill on the battlefield in a process known as blooding. McBride was not in court on Thursday for the announcement of the November 6 proceedings against him. The trial is expected to last for 6 weeks. A previous move to protect him from prosecution due to his actions being in the public interest was abandoned. Washington's crackdown on whistleblowers poses danger to free speech. The U.S. government is tightening its grip over the Internet, social media, and free speech. Facebook * whistleblower Ryan Hartwig and former Google and YouTube software engineer Zach Voorhees reveal the dangers and implications. A U.S. bill targeting the TikTok app is really a wider crackdown on online privacy and public scrutiny of the government, 2 big tech whistleblowers have told Sputnik. The Restrict Act, currently working its way through the U.S. Congress, has been touted as an attack on Chinese software developer ByteDance, whose U.S. CEO Xiao Zhichu was hauled before the House Energy and Commerce Committee in March. The legislation would allow the government to restrict access to apps from any firm it chooses, raising the prospect of its use to protect U.S. firms from foreign competitors. But tech experts and free speech advocates fear it will open the door to a widespread crackdown against online critics of the White House. Ryan Hartwig said the legislation was essentially the Patriot Act Online, referring to legislation passed in the wake of the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks that allowed unwarranted government wiretapping of U.S. and foreign citizens' phone lines. It's a horrible piece of legislation. Basically, it's not only banning TikTok, it's giving the government authority to arrest people for anything they say online. It's definitely clear that the government wants to continue to restrict free speech online, Hartwig said. It is really a problem. They are going to crack down. The bill is ostensibly aimed at protecting children and teenagers from harmful content, which the former Facebook employee said had some validity. But the Restrict Act does a lot more than just censor a few bad posts. It basically gives them blanket authority, and criminalizes any kind of political speech. If I just attack them, if I say bad things about the president, it gives the government authority to arrest me. Hartwig stressed. The Restrict Act can punish people for whistleblowing on an illegal government action. Just this week, 21-year-old U.S. Air National Guard enlisted airman Jack Teixeira was arrested as the suspect in the embarrassing Pentagon leaks of Ukrainian plans for its yet-to-materialize spring counter-offensive. Teixeira was traced through an online chat group for video gamers on the Discord app. The whistleblower said its users should be concerned. The blockchain technology used by Bitcoin and other concerns, essentially a variant of mass file sharing for online data, could protect users' rights, he said. There are websites that are using blockchain technology to avoid censorship, which is great. So there's one called Bastion that is blockchain-based and cannot be deleted off the internet, Hartwig explained, calling the technology the future of the internet. But protecting oneself from government snooping is difficult for the average causal web surfer. Unless you're a tech nerd, and you have all kinds of things for it, Hartwig says. It starts with using a different operating system, because most people use Microsoft Windows. So a lot are moving over to Linux, which has less vulnerabilities, he said. Using a virtual private network, VPN, protects users from advertisers gleaning their web history, but it's hard to prevent that from tracking us because I'm sure the NSA has tools that can bypass pretty much anything, he added. They probably know exactly what we're talking about. People are waking up to government censorship and surveillance, Hartwig insisted. It's important for us to realize that the government is not our friend. If that bill passes, then the United States will have become essentially a police state. We will no longer be a free country. Zach Voorhees emphasized that the point of online snooping was not to eavesdrop on citizens, but to tar them by association with known suspects. We know from the Snowden leaks that the NSA tracks by default the endpoints of communication. It turns out that the most valuable part of a communication is not the content that is said but identifying who is talking to who in order to build a relationship graph. Even AI assistants like Amazon Alexa have been used to record their users' conversations. Police have used court orders to grab audio content from these Alexas when they were supposedly not in active recording mode, the tech expert noted. Voorhees agreed that users of internet chats like Discord and 4chan should be concerned, because no corporate or public space is safe for private speech anymore. That ship sailed long ago. He said the government and major tech corporations were strong-arming companies to employ AI monitoring of content. We saw this in the 2020 election when the iPhone App Store kicked Parler for not integrating content-approved moderation, Voorhees noted. It looks like the government is going to play a soft hand for the meantime and let the big tech organizations employ massive censorship through their terms of service. The tech guru said it would take about a day for someone with the coding know-how to write software for a private space on the internet, which government agencies would be unable to crack. It's my expectation that the elite families that control governments and military are using such obscure private spaces to communicate, he ventured. I can't stress enough what an exciting time we are entering. It's also terrifying as we are entering an age of so many unknowns. It's obvious that Pandora's box has been opened, and the elites are putting both hands in and gripping tightly. FBI arrests member of U.S. National Guard in leaked document probe. The FBI announced the arrest of a member of the Massachusetts Air National Guard in connection to the leak of highly classified military documents on the conflict in Ukraine and U.S. relations with other countries. Investigators believe the guardsman, identified as 21-year-old Jack Teixeira of Swansea, Massachusetts, led a chat group where the documents were posted. The guardsman specialized in intelligence, two people familiar with the investigation told the AP on anonymity. The National Guard did not confirm the guardsman's identity but released a statement that we are aware of the investigation into the alleged role a Massachusetts Air National Guardsman may have played in the recent leak of highly classified documents. The Washington Post reported that the individual who leaked the information shared documents with a small group of friends on the chat platform, Discord. The files have publicized the potential vulnerabilities of Ukraine's air defense capabilities. The leaks have also shown U.S. spying on allies, including South Korea and Israel. The Pentagon is tightening the circle of employees and contracts and promised to review its policy in granting top-secret clearance. Ukraine a non-existent country financially, Orban. The conflict will end as soon as the West stops giving money to Kiev, the Hungarian PM has insisted. The EU will not provide Kiev with funds indefinitely, Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban warned Friday during an interview with a Kossuth radio station. Effectively, Ukraine is a non-existent country in financial terms, he declared. The fall in economic indicators is huge, which is completely understandable due to the war. Obviously, Ukraine can't finance itself, the Hungarian leader explained. The EU is now paying Ukrainian salaries, pensions and healthcare, allocating huge sums, which the European economy is missing out on, the PM pointed out. He added that this support can't continue indefinitely. According to Orban, the question is whether the West wants to continue sustaining Ukraine. The moment when America and Europe answer no to that question, the war will end, he stressed. Budapest is also involved in financing the Kiev government through joint EU mechanisms, but despite this, the situation keeps deteriorating for the Hungarian minority in Ukraine's Transcarpathian region, the Prime Minister said. Orban had previously complained about Ukraine mistreating ethnic Hungarians in the country's western region. In his speech in February, the PM claimed that Hungarian symbols are being brought down in settlements across Transcarpathia, heads of Hungarian language schools are being removed, while many ethnic Hungarians are dying on the front line. The EU, its member states, and financial institutions have provided more than $55.30 billion in financial support to Kiev since the outbreak of fighting between Russia and Ukraine more than a year ago, including €12 billion in arms and €30 billion in macro-financial aid. Hungary has supplied humanitarian aid to Kiev, but refused to send arms to President Vladimir Zelensky's government, unlike many fellow EU members. Budapest has consistently called for a peaceful settlement to the conflict and criticized the sanctions imposed by Brussels on Moscow, arguing that they have failed to achieve their goal and were hurting the EU more than Russia. As dollar demand shrinks, U.S. deficit headache swells. The U.S. federal government's budget deficit reached $1.1 trillion in the first half of the fiscal year 2023, as per the U.S. Treasury Department, which is roughly $600 billion less than the similar figure for the similar period of FY 2021. There's one factor forcing the U.S. government to buckle down ASAP and start fixing the economy. The U.S. Treasury's March figures came as an unpleasant surprise given that in February the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, projected a federal budget deficit of $1.4 trillion for fiscal year 2023, prompting concerns that the real number for FY23 will mount over $2 trillion. Still, it's not something unprecedented given that in FY21, the U.S. budget deficit totaled a whopping $2.8 trillion, equal to 12.4% of gross domestic product. Is there a reason to worry? Back in February, Senator Chuck Grassley recalled how he and then Senator Joe Biden raised the alarm over the budget deficit in 1984. In 1984, when faced with $200 billion deficits and a national debt nearing $2 trillion, an emphatic Democrat said, Joe Biden warned of economic disaster unless Congress took dramatic actions on deficits right now. He was advocating for a government-wide spending freeze, a bipartisan proposal that he and I led to restore fiscal restraint to the federal government. However, now the U.S. budget deficits routinely climb over $1 trillion, total national debt has surpassed $31 trillion, 15 times larger than in 1984, and nobody in the government seems to be freaking out. Why nobody in U.S. seemed concerned about deficits for decades? The U.S. budget deficit is an old story, said Dr. Paul Craig Roberts, a U.S. economist and ex-assistant secretary of the Treasury under Ronald Reagan, speaking to Sputnik in September 2022. U.S. citizens do not appear concerned by the mounting numbers since they have been hearing about large and growing budget deficits all their lives and nothing yet had happened, he noted. Indeed, in February 2022, Pew Research's list of top priorities saw the budget deficit issue ranking only 11th, with around 45% feeling somewhat concerned about rallying figures. A budget deficit occurs when spending exceeds revenues during a defined period. For instance, in fiscal year 2022, the federal government spent $6.27 trillion while collecting just $4.90 trillion in revenue, resulting in a $1.38 trillion deficit. For comparison's sake, a budget surplus occurs when the federal government collects more money than it spends, which happened 5 times in the last 50 years, most recently in 2000 and 2001, when the federal government had budget surpluses of $236 billion and $128 billion, respectively. As long as the dollar is the reserve currency and is used to settle most international payments, the U.S. deficits are financed by countries holding their foreign reserves in U.S. dollar securities, Dr. Roberts explained. So foreigners finance the U.S. deficit and the Federal Reserve itself buys any overhang. This is why the deficit has not been a problem. Dr. Roberts warned that if the demand for the dollar abruptly shrank and the greenback no longer is the world's dominant reserve currency, Washington's budget deficit and soaring gross federal debt will become a real problem. The size of the national deficit largely depends on the health of the country's economy and spending policies approved by U.S. lawmakers and implemented by the president. If the nation's population and its businesses are making less money, the government gets lesser revenues. The federal government's spending policies also matter. If it is going on a spending spree, the odds of the country ending up with a budget deficit are getting higher. The latest spike has been largely explained by excessive spending, partially because of the Biden administration's student loan forgiveness program and bailing out of 2 collapsed U.S. banks, as well as soaring interest payments on outstanding debt, due to the Federal Reserve's aggressive interest rate hikes. On the other hand, the Treasury found that total revenues have decreased in the first 6 months of FY 2023 if compared to the previous year. The trend was predictable, given that the skyrocketing trade deficit for 2022 exposed shrinking production in the U.S. To make the picture more complete, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation has drawn attention to the fact that the debt held by the public at the end of March 2023 amounted to $24.6 trillion, $0.7 trillion higher than a year ago. According to the NYC-based foundation, since the global financial crisis in 2008, debt held by the public has almost tripled relative to the size of the economy. Meanwhile, the U.S. gross federal debt, which is the sum of debt held by the public and intragovernmental debt, has already gone through the roof and now amounts to $31.46 trillion. While the U.S. Treasury admits that debt and deficits are on an unsustainable upward trajectory, a long-time steady demand for the greenback across the world has lulled U.S. financial officials into believing that the country has all the time in the world to balance the budget. Why shrinking dollar use is a big problem for U.S. While the GOP is pointing the finger of blame at the Obama and the Biden administrations for excessive money printing and soaring debt, the crux of the matter is that both parties stopped caring about deficits over the past 30 years, as per U.S. historians. According to them, since the 1990s the GOP has become consumed with cutting taxes over balanced budgets, while the Dems placed emphasis on social spending. It appears that at some point both parties started to believe that the risks of budget deficits aren't as great as once thought. This shift in perception coincided with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that led to the rapid and tremendous expansion of the US dollar area. The US took over the USSR's markets and sphere of influence and watched the Soviet Empire's industrial potential crumbling. The greenback became the global dominant reserve currency, with the US facing its unique unipolar moment. It seemed at the time that Pax Americana would thrive forever. However, Mikhail Hazen, a Russian economist and publicist, who served in the Working Center for Economic Reforms under the Boris Yeltsin government in the 1990s, predicted the demise of the US dollar dominance roughly 20 years ago. In his book titled The Decline of the Dollar Empire and the End of Pax Americana, Hazen and his co-author Andrei Kobiakov explained why the investment process, which has long been fundamentally dollar-based, is unsustainable and why it is absolutely necessary that the dollar be replaced by other investment currencies. Speaking to the media in January 2023, Hazen explained that there is a process underway of the creation of several new currency zones. The trend, which, according to The Economist, was inevitable, has been facilitated by Washington's sweeping sanctions against big global players, including Russia, and the use of the dollar as a punishing mechanism. By arresting Russia's central bank assets, severing the nation from SWIFT and prohibiting exports of US dollar-denominated banknotes to the country, Washington sent an ominous signal to the other world players. In addition, the U.S. Federal Reserve's aggressive rate hikes unsettled the economy of third world countries who traditionally took loans in U.S. dollars, exactly as the International Monetary Fund, IMF, predicted last year. De facto, the U.S. exported its inflation to the rest of the world, something which frustrated many in the global south. Russia, China, India, and other countries accelerated their shift to settlements in national currencies, including for energy deals which have long been settled in greenbacks. BRICS, an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, started to consider the creation of common currency. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has gone even further by seeking to reduce dependence not only on the greenback but also on euros, yens, and British pounds in financial transactions. Earlier this year, President of Brazil Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva touched upon the issue of the creation of a common currency for Mercosur, a South American trade bloc, with his Argentine counterpart Alberto Fernandez. The emerging trend means reduced demand for the US dollar and shrinking dollar area, exactly what Dr. Roberts warned about this over the past few years. The US could print money because the dollar was the world reserve currency and everyone used the dollar for its own international transactions, Dr. Roberts said. Symes, Jr. On April 13. But if the dollar starts losing this role and fewer countries use it for international transactions, how's the Fed going or the government going to print dollars to pay its bills, if it's not the reserve currency, is not in universal demand? So what happens if the dollar would, poof, go down? That would mean a massive US inflation. It'd be a kind of inflation that results from currency collapse. There's nothing monetary authorities can do about that. Those kinds of inflations are the real inflations, the real deadly ones. How long will the dollar hold on? How long will it survive? How quick will the transition be away from the dollar? So, it means the demise of the dollar as the world reserve currency, which means the demise of American power, because American power is based on the ability to pay bills by printing money. It appears that the GOP and the Dems should hurry up to reconcile themselves to rapidly changing global economic reality. They definitely don't have all the time in the world. French court to have final say on Macron's pensions reform. France's Constitutional Council on Friday prepared to hand down its verdict on President Emmanuel Macron's unpopular pension reform, which could clear the way for the changes to be implemented. Barriers have been erected in the streets near the court in central Paris and anti-riot police have been deployed to guard its headquarters, with potentially violent protests feared later when the decision is announced at 6 p.m., 1600 hours o'clock GMT. The country has been rocked by 3 months of demonstrations and strikes over Macron's bid to raise the retirement age to 64 from 62, with around 2 in 3 voters against the changes, according to polls. Experts believe the most likely scenario on Friday is that the 9-member Constitutional Council will censure some non-essential parts of the legislation but approve the main elements. The Council will likely follow the course it always had not to counter big social or societal reforms, constitutional expert Laura Lean Fontaine told AFP. But labor unions and opposition lawmakers are still hoping for a decision to strike down the changes that Macron championed during his first period in office and put at the heart of his second term, which began last May. A rejection of the law would be a disaster for Emmanuel Macron, political journalist Ludovic Vigogny, who has written a recent book on the president, told RTL Radio on Friday. He would have no margin for maneuver. It would be such a huge victory for his political opponents. Police are expecting up to 10,000 protesters in the capital later Friday, including hundreds of radical leftists, a source told AFP. Several possible demonstrations are being monitored at the City Town Hall and at the Louvre Museum, not far from the Constitutional Council. Cover: musicians perform during a concert by an inter-orchestra/entertainment workers symphonic orchestra to protest a pensions reform, as the Council of State is reflected in mirrors, on the Place du Palais Royal in Paris, France, April 9, 2023. South Korea to offer allowance to reclusive youths. A record low fertility rate has left the country with an aging population and a shrinking workforce. A measure passed by South Korea's Ministry of Gender Equality and Family will offer reclusive youths aged 9 to 24 a monthly financial stipend in a bid to reintegrate them into society, as the Asian country attempts to confront a dwindling birth rate, which also threatens productivity. The scheme will see people suffering from hikikomori, a Japanese term which describes extreme social withdrawal, provided with a monthly allowance of 650,000 won, $499. Around 350,000 South Koreans aged between 19 and 39 are estimated to be suffering from the condition, or around 3% of that total age group, per the South Korea Institute for Health and Social Affairs. This policy is fundamentally a welfare measure, Shin Yeol, a political science professor at Seoul's Myeongji University, told Bloomberg on Wednesday. Yeol, though, cautioned that the allowance cannot be seen as a long-term solution to fix the population problem here. Records this year indicate that South Korea is the only country in the world to have a fertility rate below 1, with women producing an average of 0.78 children. The country also has a high rate of youth unemployment at 7.2%, with both factors leading to concerns about the implications on Seoul's socio-economic future. The country's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, last month described the low birth rate figures as a crucial national agenda. A document outlining the plans released by South Korea's government this week said that reclusive youths predominantly come from disadvantaged upbringings. Many of those affected, it says, began demonstrating reclusive tendencies in their adolescence. Seoul said this week that the allowance will enable reclusive youth to recover their daily lives and reintegrate into society. It will assist with education or health care requirements, including addressing issues such as scarring in some instances, or issues that adolescents may feel ashamed of. The program also includes an allowance for teenagers for cultural events. Last year, Seoul announced another social program which would triple financial support to would-be mothers in a bid to encourage more births in the country. Donbass vets share stories about how war came to their home in 2014. April 14 marks the 9th anniversary since Kiev began an anti-terrorist operation in the Donbass in 2014 aimed at crushing an uprising by residents opposed to the post-coup government. How did the militias arise? What motivated their members? What message do vets have for Westerners today? Sputnik reached out to them to find out. It all began not with a bang, but the distinct sound of tank treads clanging against the pavement of roads leading into the Donbass towns and cities, accompanied by the shooting of unarmed men and women gathering in front of columns of Ukrainian tanks and armored vehicles and refusing to let them pass. Who are you going to shoot? A man shouted in a news report from Kramatorsk, a major metallurgical center in northern Donetsk from April 17, 2014. I'm not going to fight, a soldier told a reporter from atop an infantry fighting vehicle, smiling and shaking his head. I'm against all of this. Authorities in Kiev decided to kick off the anti-terrorist operation, ATO, in the Donbass after a wave of large-scale pro-Russian protests engulfed much of eastern and southeastern Ukraine, with people in regions from Kharkov to Odessa holding meetings, seizing administrative buildings, proclaiming people's republics and announcing their intention to hold independence and autonomy referendums. The unrest in the east began to percolate in the immediate aftermath of the February 2014 coup, which brought vehemently anti-Russian, Western-backed political forces supported by ultranationalist thugs to power in Kiev. Acting President Alexander Turchinov announced the military operation a week before it began, saying in a television address on April 7 that Ukrainian forces would conduct anti-terrorist activities against armed secessionists in the country's east. Turchinov blamed Russia for the unrest, claiming Moscow sought to overthrow the government and disrupt snap presidential elections scheduled for May. Freshly installed Interior Minister Arsen Avakov boasted that Kiev would crush the unrest, by talks or by force, within 48 hours. There are two opposite ways for resolving this crisis, a political dialogue or the heavy-handed approach. We are ready for both, he said on April 9. On April 14, Turchinov signed a decree that officially began the ATO. On April 15, troops from the Interior Ministry, as well as the Ukrainian military's Alpha Special Forces Unit, began an operation to secure Kramatorsk's airfield. Helicopter gunships fired on members of self-defense units who had set up a makeshift checkpoint at the airfield. Multiple militiamen were killed and several more injured in fighting with Ukrainian troops. Hundreds of local residents came out to confront the army, while others set up barricades at administrative buildings. On April 16, Kiev announced the partial mobilization of men with military experience and the transfer of troops from western and central Ukraine to the east for deployment alongside local forces. Avakov's promise to end the crisis in 48 hours eventually turned into 48 days, 48 weeks, 48 months, and longer, as fighting in the Donbass intensified, ultimately escalating into the full-blown proxy conflict between Russia and NATO and Ukraine that it is today. We thought it would all be over with soon. Everything seemed peaceful at first, recalled Vitaly Shetkov, a Donetsk People's Militia veteran who joined the resistance in 2014. But then a shell flew into our village and exploded right next to my house with my wife and children inside. I can't put into words how scared I was. Then came anger, resentment, and a lot of questions. Shetkov, who goes by the call sign Tiki, lit. Quiet, said. Before the conflict, Shetkov operated a small construction materials delivery business. My grandfather fought in World War II, he fought in Berlin. Me and many of my friends and colleagues were enraged by these monsters, who started shooting at civilians out of the blue. So I volunteered in 2014, we were just volunteers then, basically nobodies, the militiaman said. I decided that I was no longer prepared to risk my family, to lose my loved ones. I didn't want to let the enemy come even closer, and instead wanted to drive them away from here so they could not harm anyone. I could not remain indifferent or abandon my land, my roots. Fyodor Romanov, another militiaman from the DPR, said he had subconsciously realized that a major conflict had started, even if he initially didn't want to admit it to himself, after Ukraine began to use heavy military aviation. Bomb the village of Mariinka and attack a local coal mine in May 2014. I didn't think it would stretch out like this. I hoped that it would be settled, but couldn't imagine that it would escalate into this conflict in which everyone and their brother is involved. I thought it would all go faster, that they'd prattle on and come to an agreement. But the exact opposite happened, the factory worker said. We thought that this would all end soon. A year and a half max, no one expected it to be any longer, the militiaman said. Spontaneity to the point of absurdity. Romanov, call sign Tsar, joined the ragtag Donetsk militias in the spring of 2014, manning makeshift block posts together with other local residents. The militias somehow formed naturally. At first, this referendum took place Donbass Status Referendum of May 2014, ed. Then a lot of guys I knew went to many checkpoints. We went together, talked, and kind of became friends. At first we stood there, to the point of absurdity, armed with sticks, kitchen knives. A lot of people came out with hunting rifles, turning them into sawn-off shotguns. They made homemade explosives so that the enemy could not pass. Of course, with such weapons we were easy targets, so we were afraid. We were standing 40 minutes from Mariinka, where Ukrainian troops were already quite well entrenched. We were afraid that they would come here in the direction of Petrovka, because attempts to enter had been made more than once. We were afraid of this because they had a lot more weapons and, in general, a lot more of everything than we did, Romanov recalled. Chekhov painted a similar picture, saying the militias began to form among completely ordinary guys, who joined with the clothes on their backs, t-shirts, jeans, and some of them armed with double-barreled rifles. Of course, there weren't so many weapons, and it was very difficult, especially at the beginning. People came with basically pitchforks and kitchen knives. Then commanders began to appear, specific formations were created, more suitable weapons were issued. I gave my car to the guys, and myself went to a checkpoint near Mariinka. I asked for this particular detachment because I'm a local, I know everything here very well, live here, this is my home, I would guard it. That's how our Petrovsky battalion, named after the commander, Ed. Note, was created. Romanov noted that when the militias were created, volunteers received no pay, and had to pay for their expenses out of pocket. Everyone joined for an idea, no one even thought about money. And then the first monetary payments began to be given out, sometime in June, because we had no cigarettes or tea. Civilians helped a lot, giving whatever we could. The fighter confirmed that gradually, militias began to be equipped with better weapons, including machine guns, and to be moved around, to battles in Sneznoye, Sormogyla, Ilovaisk, Shuktursk, Mariinka. Romanov fought in two of the decisive battles of 2014 to 2015, the siege of Slavyansk and the battle for the Donetsk airport. The fighter received multiple injuries, including a bullet wound at the airport. The battles still continue to haunt him in his dreams, he said. Romanov completed his service with the DPR internal troops and was decommissioned in early 2022 due to his injuries. Chekhov also carries the scars of the war on his body, losing his right hand while neutralizing a tripwire, suffering a contusion which affected his memory, and having his leg shot in 2 places. He now works at military HQ. Like Romanov, Chekhov also took part in the battle for the Donetsk airport. When it was all over, my only thought was, thank God I'm alive, he said. Cruelty from the start. In Romanov's experience, Ukrainian forces sent to try to crush the Donbass Spring in 2014 were motivated to carry out Kiev's orders from the beginning, and showed no hesitation in brutally putting down the poorly armed, trained and organized defenders. They immediately came at us with tanks, immediately began softening up Mariinka, engaging in heavy bombing using Grad rocket artillery. And immediately, 5 to 10 minutes later, tanks would appear. That is, they were prepared for a crusade. Our 1st Slavyanskaya Brigade was stationed near Mariinka. They failed to withstand the Ukrainian military's thrust. Our guys were forced to retreat. They entered the city and began to fortify themselves and dig in. To this day, even Russian forces cannot push them out of there. Everything has been filled with concrete there since 2014. They were getting ready, the fighter stressed. Chekhov confirmed that to him it didn't seem like Ukrainian forces didn't want to fight against the people of the Donbass. They used people, young guys like cannon fodder. They did not consider it necessary to save their people. And behind them, were these terrible nationalist battalions who would follow after them and shoot. Romanov suggested that unfortunately, many Ukrainians, both young and old, seem to have been brainwashed by the media and other institutions in recent decades into treating Russians as the sworn enemies of Ukraine who aren't worthy of anything except death. In Ukraine, they are rewriting history. It's forbidden to talk about any history about Russia, although everyone born before 1980 still knows about the Great Patriotic War, where all our grandfathers, the Poles, the Georgians, the Ukrainians all fought together. This history has been distorted and turned upside down, and now they salute Bandera Stepan Bandera, a Ukrainian fascist and World War II Nazi collaborator, ed.note. Others, particularly civilians, have been frightened into silence, Romanov believes. I look at these young guys and think, how was it possible to twist their brains like this so they would obediently march like slaves? Shetkov asked. On one hand, this was a fratricidal war when everything first began. On the other, this was no longer the same Ukraine, after they raised Nazi flags, coats of arms and crosses. Horrific memory. Asked if there were any battles he took part in that stood out, Romanov replied the Battle of Sormogyla in eastern Donetsk, which took place over several weeks in July-August of 2014. In it, about 100 militiamen faced off against 600 Ukrainian troops in what he said could only be described as something out of a horror movie. Warning, the paragraph below contains graphic and disturbing descriptions not suitable for all readers. Please skip ahead to the next paragraph if you are easily offended or disturbed. An enemy soldier was crawling forward, he got his hand blown off. He got up and continued on. That is, the Ukrainian troops were either drugged up or under the influence. Any sane person, if his hand was torn off by a fragment of a shell or bullet, would go into shock. But this soldier simply rose, picked up his severed hand and continued to move forward. He did not run away, did not hide, but continued to try to attack us. That was the most memorable thing for me, because I could only see such a thing in the movies. When you see it with your own eyes and witness it, your view of humans, and in general your view of everything around you changes. It was frightening, not normal, the militiaman said. Romanov said that doing the sign of the cross and remembering his family helped him during the most difficult moments, and noted that in the trenches, everyone turns into a believer. No matter how difficult things got, the militiaman said, fighters retained a spark in their eyes. The hope that we would win and everything would be fine, that peace would arrive. Special message to foreigners. Asked if there was any special message he would like to send Sputnik's non-Russian speaking readers, Romanov said that first of all, he'd like to convey the importance of living in peace. If there is peace, what difference does it make whether a person is an Englishman or a Frenchman? We can live without war. But right now it turns out that someone somewhere has decided that war means a lot of money to be made, the militiaman said. As Soviet Bard Vladimir Vysotsky said, it doesn't matter who you are, but be a human being first. We were defending ourselves, and Russia came to our aid. We didn't come to them in England. We don't organize wars in America. We are defending our land. Live in peace and everything will be all right, Romanov emphasized. Asked the same question, Shetkov answered in a different way, addressing any citizens of NATO countries who may already be taking part in the hostilities on the Ukrainian side. The only thing I'd like to say is, stay home. We aren't touching you, don't touch us, we'll figure things out ourselves. Bring back your husbands and brothers, who are also dying here like the Ukrainians. The people who are making decisions sitting on the other side think they're doing good. They don't understand what they're doing. Your readers probably already understand, but those who we come across here speak Polish and English, I don't know. Take your people home. We'll figure this out, we want for this to be over already, the militiaman said. Shetkov recalled the heroic role played by Polish troops who fought alongside the Red Army in liberating Ukraine during World War II. Volodymyr Zelensky's grandfather fought, he helped liberate Ukraine. Now they despise the veterans, they have begun to destroy the churches for which our great-grandfathers fought. There is nothing good in this. France, Britain, America, they also fought against the Germans. What are they doing now? These are real-life fascists, he said. The militiaman emphasized that as a resident of the Donbass, he would be prepared to defend his home even against 1,000 enemies, if necessary. Unlike them, we understand what we are fighting for, what the goal is, what we are protecting. They do not understand, they are caught, put in a uniform, given a machine gun and sent to the front. That's why they surrender or allow themselves to be captured. They understand that they don't need this. We are fighting for our native land. For someone to run away, to be afraid, fear is necessary in principle, only you cannot be a coward, and must win back your own and cover your comrades' back, the veteran concluded. Iran urges international probes into reports of U.S. funded biolabs across the world. Iran on Thursday called for impartial international probes into reports of the U.S. funded military biological laboratories in Ukraine and other parts of the world. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani issued the call in a post on his Twitter page, in response to a report released on Wednesday by a Russian parliamentary commission investigating Washington's military-related biological activities in Ukraine. The commission said that the U.S. is developing a universal genetically altered bioweapon comparable to that of a nuclear winter. The report of the U.S. funded military biological labs in Ukraine and some other countries are deeply worrying, Kanani wrote. He stressed that such activities, which are in contradiction with the U.S. international commitments, especially those made under the Biological Weapons Convention, pose a threat to humanity. In its 207-page report, the Russian Commission added that the probe into the manufacturing of the highly destructive bioweapon was based on the findings made public by Russia's radiation, chemical and biological defense troops over the past year. Soon after launching its military operations in Ukraine in February 2022, Russia accused the U.S. of pursuing a secret bioweapons program in the European state. Both the U.S. and Ukraine have denied the charges. Last month, the Russian Defense Ministry said that, a few months after the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russian forces began to collect information about the U.S. biological lab's role and functions in the country. G7 sanctions threaten millions of Indian jobs, media. Restrictions are expected to be introduced at the organization's summit in May, according to the outlet. The G7 is set to impose sanctions on large rough diamonds sourced from Russia, The Economic Times reported on Wednesday, citing industry executives. The move would potentially threaten millions of jobs in India, which is the world's largest cutting and polishing center for the gems. The ban, which would cover diamonds weighing 1 carat or more, is expected to be introduced at the G7 summit in Hiroshima in May, according to the outlet. Russia's diamond trade has so far avoided sanctions due to resistance from major importers such as Belgium, which is home to the world's biggest diamond trading hub in Antwerp. Brussels has repeatedly blocked the EU's embargo plans, warning that the move could cost thousands of jobs. Now uncertainty is looking for millions in India who are employed in the industry for cutting and polishing gems. We have been hearing from different sources that there will be fresh sanctions and it will start with large diamonds, said the chairman of the Gem and Jewellery Export Promotion Council, Vipul Shah. However, we do not have any idea in what form the sanctions will come in. This will impact the employment of diamond workers in Surat as well as in Saurashtra, Amreli, and Bhavnagar, he added. 9 out of 10 diamonds in the world are cut and polished at a hub in Surat, Western India, where an estimated 3 million people rely on the industry for employment, according to official numbers. Currently, India can freely export rough gems originating from Russia to the US and other G7 countries as long as they have been substantially altered. Following the transformation, the system code used to identify diamonds in cross-border trade is also changed. The development comes as the EU and G7 look into ways of hunting down Russian diamonds across borders, with plans to introduce a watertight tracking system that would restrict their trade. The G7, which comprises the US, Canada, Germany, France, Italy, the UK, and Japan, pledged in February to work collectively on further measures on Russian diamonds, including rough and polished ones, given the significant revenues that Russia extracts from the export of gems. Russia's mining giant Alrosa is the world's largest diamond producer and accounts for 30% of the $80 billion global trade in rough diamonds. Europe faces challenges with inflation, economic recovery, financial stability. Europe is experiencing challenges with high inflation, slow economic recovery and financial stability across the continent, Director of the International Monetary Fund's (IMF) European Department Alfred Kammer said on Friday. Europe avoided an all-out recession this winter and showed resilience, but it is facing a triple challenge: defeat inflation, sustain the recovery, and safeguard financial stability, Kammer told reporters. He warned that inflation remains stubbornly high and continues to be in double digits in most emerging European economies and some advanced economies. Energy prices have fallen, but prices of other household expenses are still increasing at a fast pace, he added. Kammer also noted that economic activity has decelerated across the continent, and growth slowed in key trading partners. Instability in the banking and financial sectors, which appeared in recent weeks, has added shadows over the continent's near-term economic prospects, he emphasized. Things could easily get more complicated, as discussed in more detail in our new Regional Economic Outlook, which will be released on April 28. Tight labor markets, a resurgence of energy prices, or increasing geopolitical fragmentation could bring both lower growth and higher inflation. Failure to contain financial stability risks could lead to crisis and lower growth, Kammer said. He urged European governments to implement decisive measures in the fight against inflation, and to maintain tight monetary policy until the situation improves. Kammer also emphasized that further increases in policy rates are required in the euro area, while emerging economies should stand ready to tighten their measures if it is necessary. For most countries, governments should pursue more ambitious fiscal consolidation than is currently planned. This is needed both to place inflation firmly on a path to target and to replenish depleted fiscal space, particularly in view of the fact that shocks have become more prevalent, he said. The IMF official also called for reforms to boost productivity, and pointed out that Europe needs investments to speed up the green transition. Central Bank Governor, China's GDP to grow around 5%, property market warms up. China's economy is on track to recovery and the growth rate is expected to be about 5% this year, Central Bank Governor Yi Gang said at a speech while attending the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, IMF, spring meetings in Washington. The forecast is in line with the Chinese government's annual target. In his remark, Yi said that China's inflation remains low and the property market has shown positive changes. The G20 finance ministers and central bank governors who attended the meeting generally agreed that the global economy is under considerable pressure with compounded risks of high inflation, tightening monetary policy, and geopolitical tensions. According to a statement by the People's Bank of China on Friday. The recent banking sector turmoil in advanced economies was also brought up at the meeting where policy coordination to maintain financial stability was a focus. Officials attending the meeting supported the strengthening of the global financial safety net, reiterating the push forward with the IMF's 16th General Review of Quotas. Quotas are the main source of funding for the IMF, and the financial agency in turn lends to countries in times of crisis. The 16th General Review of Quotas will revisit the adequacy of quotas and is set to be completed no later than December 15 this year. Officials also called on more countries to participate in helping vulnerable economies to recover by joining the IMF's special drawing rights and debt resolution framework. Yi emphasized that IMF member countries should take concrete actions to ensure the smooth completion of the 16th General Review of Quotas as scheduled, adding that China is willing to work with all members to implement a common framework for debt resolution. French tightening belts, media. Consumers have been cutting down on expenses, according to research. Sales volumes at major retail chains in France have declined in the first 3 months of the year against a backdrop of soaring prices, news channel BFM TV reported on Friday, citing a study by analytical center the Circana Institute. Faced with inflation, the French reduced their purchases in the first quarter. According to the Circana Institute, supermarket sales in the first 3 months of this year fell by 5% compared to 2022, BFM TV stated. It indicated that surging prices pushed the turnover of large-scale retailers up by 9.1% during the same period in annual terms. Data showed that sales of oils have been the most affected, plummeting by 53.1%. Sales of care and hygiene products reportedly dropped by 52.8%, while starch sales declined by 26.4%. The cost of living crisis has deepened in France. According to a recent report by statistics agency INSEE, inflation in the Eurozone's second-largest economy continued to grow at a record pace and rose faster than expected in February, largely due to surging food prices. Food, services, and manufactured goods have been the main contributors to rising inflation. French authorities previously introduced a so-called anti-inflation food basket comprising about 50 basic items, and have obliged large retailers not to hike prices on these essentials. U.S. budget deficit balloons by $1.1 trillion. Is America's massive debt bubble about to burst? The U.S. is the most heavily indebted nation on Earth, with the national debt standing at over $31.7 trillion, or 125% of GDP. When accounting for personal, local and state obligations, the figure is triple that, $95 trillion, equivalent to the GDP of the whole planet. How big is the danger of this debt bubble bursting? Sputnik explores. The Congressional Budget Office released fresh figures this week revealing that the federal budget shortfall had reached $1.1 trillion in the first half of fiscal year 2023, $430 billion higher than it was during the same period in 2022. Simply put, the federal deficit is the amount the federal government spends above whatever taxes, tariffs, and other revenues it manages to wring out of the population, corporations, and foreign governments in a given period. When spending exceeds income, the state makes up for it by issuing treasury bonds, debt obligations, or printing money. The 2023 deficit is not the highest in U.S. history or even in recent years, with both the Biden administration and its direct predecessors, the Trump, Obama and Bush teams presiding over multi-trillion-dollar deficits as the feds pumped pallets of cash into the economy during COVID and the 2008 financial crisis. But this time things may be different. Unlike 2009 to 2011 and 2020 to 2021, the spike in the deficit isn't related to a clearly observable economic collapse. The economy is supposedly doing great, according to Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. The U.S. economy is obviously performing exceptionally well, she said at a press conference Tuesday. So I'm not anticipating a downturn in the economy, although of course that remains a risk, Yellen added. Instead, the CBO blames declining revenues, -3%, or $73 billion, and spiking spending, $3.1 trillion, or +13%, for the jump in the deficit. The loss in revenues has been attributed to dropping income and payroll tax receipts, -2%, or $33 billion, a drop in customs duties, -15%, or $7 billion. And a hefty drop in remittances from the Federal Reserve accrued from interest rates, from $61 billion at this time in 2022 to less than $1 billion now. But the government did apparently make good on last year's promises to hire an army of IRS auditors, with the collection of corporate income taxes jumping upward by 10%, or $13 billion, estate and gift tax receipts climbing by $7 billion, 50%. And collections of miscellaneous fees and fines also spiking, increasing by $5 billion, a whopping 54%. The 13% jump in spending is accounted for by a variety of spending, from Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid benefits, spiking by 10%, 14%, and 8%, respectively, as well as interest payments on federal debt, which jumped by a whopping 41%, or $90 billion. Compared to 2022 due to higher interest rates. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the independent government agency designed to maintain public confidence in the banking sector, also saw outlays rise by $29 billion in the wake of the recent collapse of several big corporate banks. The Department of Education also accounted for a big chunk of spending, with outlays jumping by $53 billion, or 75%, attributable to the Biden administration's pause on student loan payments. Deficit. The spike in the deficit is nothing new in American political life. The government hasn't run a budget surplus since the late 1990s and early 2000s, when a series of cuts to the budget, including a drop in military spending thanks to the so-called post-Cold War peace dividend, allowed the feds to run modest budget surpluses of 0.8 to 2.3 for 4 straight years. Before that, the last surplus occurred in 1969 during the Johnson administration, and before that by the Eisenhower administration during 3 of his 8 years in office between 1953 and 1961. How can Washington afford to get away with running budget deficits and racking up debt year after year and decade after decade, despite being compared by some economists to a giant Ponzi scheme? The logic has been simple. In theory, low interest rates on debt and steady economic growth will mean that debt grows more slowly than GDP, meaning debt may, theoretically, eventually become negligible relative to the size of the economy. The catch, wrote Johns Hopkins economist Lawrence Ball and his Harvard colleague N. Gregory Mankiw in a prophetic 1995 explainer, is that the future paths of interest rates and GDP are uncertain. Although interest rates on government debt have usually been less than the growth of GDP, these variables fluctuate. It is possible, although not especially likely, that the economy will experience a run of bad luck, say a major depression, in which the growth rate drops below the interest rate for a sustained period. In this case, a policy of rolling over the debt will cause the debt to rise faster than national income. Eventually, the debt may become so large relative to the economy that the government has difficulty selling it, forcing a tax increase or spending cut. Moreover, these adjustments are especially painful. They are large, and they come when the economy is already suffering from a problem that has caused the debt-income ratio to rise, the economists warned. Judging by developments over the past decade or so, the U.S. may be close to reaching the point where the size of its debt relative to the overall economy reaches a critical breaking point. Judge for yourself. The U.S. debt-to-GDP ratio surpassed 100% in 2013, when both hit about $16.7 trillion. While nominal GDP has grown by about $9 trillion in the 10 years since, the debt has nearly doubled, to $31.7 trillion. Economics 101 dictates that a high debt-to-GDP ratio has a number of negative impacts on growth, deterring investors and reducing the likelihood of individuals, investors, and nations lending to a country, given the risk of the debtor not being able to pay off their debt. The United States has experienced periods of high debt-to-GDP ratios before. During and immediately after the Second World War, the ratio hit 114% in 1945 and 119% in 1946, respectively. But the situation today bears one important difference from what it was then. While the American industrial base accounted for over half of all manufactured goods produced in the world in 1945, today it accounts for about 16% and dropping. On top of that, after World War II, wide swathes of Europe and Asia lie in ruins, eagerly purchasing goods made in the USA, partially using generous subsidies afforded by the post-war Marshall Plan. Today, there are no waiting markets eager to accept U.S. industrial output. Perhaps it is the desire to return to the good old days that accounts for Washington's recent efforts to liquidate Europe's manufacturing economy and plunder its industrial base. The U.S. is on the precipice of a bleak milestone. According to economists, the cost of financing the US gargantuan federal debt reached $475 billion in 2022, its highest dollar value ever, and is expected to reach levels so high in the coming decade that it will surpass crucial programs like Medicaid and defense, and become the largest single spending item in the budget within 30 years. Traditionally, the U.S. has been able to rely on 4 key pillars to keep its economy on top: its technological edge, effective control of global financial organizations via Bretton Woods institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, the petrodollar, and the U.S. military, which stands ready to eliminate challengers to its global economic preeminence. See Muammar Gaddafi and his gold-backed dinar idea. Today, all 4 of these pillars are under pressure, with the People's Republic of China closing the gap on the U.S. technologically, and the petrodollar at risk as nations, including key U.S. allies, switch to emerging alternatives or currency swap trade. The international financial institutions that the US helped create, meanwhile, appear to show signs of going rogue, refusing to toe the line of State Department propaganda on Russia's crumbling economy, instead projecting its growth by 0.7% in 2023. The future looks bleak for the US economy. While the Treasury has recognized that debt loads are unsustainable if they get too high, the Biden White House hasn't made any visible efforts to reduce the deficit and the debt, instead rolling out more than $6 trillion in spending plans, okaying a rise in defense spending, and sending over $100 billion in weapons and economic assistance to Ukraine to fight NATO's proxy war against Russia. The debt and the deficit continue to grow, while the Fed's string of interest rate hikes has made borrowing more expensive and interest payments higher. How long Washington will be able to sustain a monetary policy that seems to consist of endlessly racking up debts is anyone's guess. However, some economists fear the federal government has already entered a doom spiral of debt from which it may not be possible to escape. Why do people willingly participate? It's because they don't realize it's a Ponzi scheme. They think they're going to be paid back. When they realize they're going to be paid back in monopoly money, they're not going to want to lend. In fact, they're not going to want to hold on to these treasuries, and the only buyer is going to be the Federal Reserve. And that's when the printing press is going to overdrive and the dollar is going to fall through the floor. Peter Schiff, one of the few U.S. economists who predicted the 2008 collapse, warned in a podcast in February. China launches various chat-like competitors in fierce AI race. Chinese tech giant Alibaba unveiled its latest chat-like artificial intelligence (AI) model product, Tong'ai Qinwen, on Tuesday. The large language AI model product can handle various types of office communications, intelligent voice assistants, turn text into images and short videos, and customize individual work plans, which the company said could improve work efficiency. Zhang Yang, chairman and CEO of Alibaba Group, said that all Alibaba products will be connected to Tong'ai Qinwen in an impending comprehensive transformation in the near future. Recently, there has been a surge in popularity of large AI models triggered by OpenAI's ChatGPT. Chinese search giant Baidu officially released its large language model and generative AI product, the Ernie Bot, on March 16. He Xiaodong, vice president of JD.com Group, said that its new large-scale model ChatJD is set to be released this year. Huawei also recently announced the progress and applications of its Pangu AI model. 360 AI, developed based on the 360 GPT large language model, was first used in search engines on April 9. Other AI products by the likes of Tencent and ByteDance are expected to be unveiled soon. Backed by China's massive base of internet users, Chinese enterprises have pressed the accelerator for the development of large AI models, from computing power to application. At the same time, Chinese enterprises still face many challenges ranging from issues relating to talent, algorithm, and model quality, to business model and security issues. China's authorities are also ramping up policies for the sector. On Tuesday, the Cyberspace Administration of China issued a statement to solicit public opinions on policies to regulate the AI space.